My name is Philip Crawford. I'm an attorney, an activist, a musician in Monterey County. I want to thank Wave Street Studios for inviting me to speak today. And I want to start off with anticipating what some of the reaction is to whoever actually ends up is watching this or watches it later on. So I'm going to say things that a lot of people disagree with, things that people don't like. In my experience, people love you and think you're brilliant if you say things that they already think, and are less receptive when you tell them things they don't want to hear. So based on previous experience, I predict that people will say I'm being counterproductive, divisive, harmful, sectarian, whatever. I may lose some Facebook friends. People will stop talking to me. Most of the negative feedback that I get will be won't address the actual content of what I'm saying. So I'm going to make some comments about terminology. I may use the terms left wing, leftist, rightist, etc. These terms actually have fairly clear meanings based on their historical usage, and essentially left-wing politics support social equality and egalitarianism and advocate for the reduction or elimination of unjustified inequalities, opposing social hierarchy and social inequality. Succinctly, the left believes that human development flourishes when individuals engage in cooperative, mutually respectful relations that can thrive only when excessive differences in status, power, and wealth are eliminated. Right-wing politics defend and promote social inequality and hierarchy as being desirable, inevitable, natural, or normal. So inequality, social inequality, hierarchy, leftists want to reduce or eliminate that. Right wing wants to defend or promote those kinds of inequalities and hierarchies. I tend to assume that people have good intentions, that people on the left who disagree with me have good intentions. It's not my intention to make personal attacks on anyone, but the fact is that you can have the best intentions in the world and cause tremendous harm. And just as a doctor who makes the wrong diagnosis can kill the patient rather than cure them, regardless of how good their intentions are. I consider the election of Donald Trump to have been to be a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportion, and based on his actions since the election and since taking office, he's actually being worse than I even anticipated, and I anticipated him to be quite bad. So imagine that we are a group of people are adrift in a lifeboat, and there's just enough water that if everybody in the boat starts paddling as hard as they can due east, there's enough water, just enough water that people will survive. So there's a group of people in the boat who have their map upside down and are paddling furiously westward. There's another group of people who thinks it's a good idea to add seawater to the water supply to make it last longer, not really realizing that that will kill everyone on the boat. So the people who say we shouldn't be drinking salt water and we should be all paddling to the east, not towards the west, and you should turn your map upside down, aren't being divisive or sectarian or counterproductive. If you think someone's wrong and what they're doing as a basis of their mistaken beliefs is harmful, then you have a duty to try to change their minds as best you can. Now, there are a lot of individuals and organizations, groups on the left in this community, my community, Monterey County, that are doing something about Trump. Well, that's great, but what is it that they're doing? If what they're doing isn't going to make a difference, then it really doesn't matter. If what they're doing is actually making things worse, then they need to be corrected. A lot of what people are doing, the mistakes that are being made, I think stem from a misunderstanding of the nature of the society that we live in. And the nature of the society that we live in is that it's not a democracy. And this is a plutocracy in which the wealthiest are irrelevant. And I'm going to anticipate a lot of some hostile reaction. I'm going to say a few things that sound like boasting or tooting my own horn. I was the president of the board of directors of the Monterey Peace and Justice Center for 3.5 years. During that time, some of the things that were said about me by other board members, or since that time, were, for instance, I was described as the only person currently providing dynamic leadership to the local peace movement. One board member described me as the best thing that had ever happened to that organization. I was widely regarded as the most effective president, the most effective fundraiser the organization had had. When I resigned my post as president, the board wrote me a thank you letter saying, among other things, "You've demonstrated your ability to effectively mobilize the peace community around actions that raised awareness of gross injustices on local and global fronts. You planted the seeds of understanding amidst diverse and often contentious groups. We're particularly grateful to you for strengthening the board. By expanding the board with a more diverse group of people, we now enjoy a broader spectrum of thought and perspective." One of the things I was particularly proud of was that while I was on the board, let's start with the peace and justice activist community, for the most part, or at least the part that I have been familiar with, was overwhelmingly English-speaking white people, overwhelmingly retirees. And while I was on the board, I was able to recruit people onto the board who were under the age of 40 and who were people of color. And then I believe when I was on the board was 70% women and 30% men. 2 years later, the board of that organization is 100% women above the age of retirement, and no blacks or Hispanics on that board. And that's not unusual. That's the way a lot of peace and justice organizations in this community operate. On June 4th, in Portland, Oregon, there was a well-publicized alt-right gathering. And since it was well-publicized, the left organized against that gathering. That demonstration on June 4th in Portland, the counter-demonstrators vastly outnumbered the fascists who showed up. There were actually enough people in Portland, there were several thousand people who showed up to protest against the alt-right, and there were actually enough people that there were 3 separate contingents, each had at least several hundred people, one of which had at least 1,000 people. And so one group was a coalition of over 70 labor and community groups led by the International Socialist Organization. On another corner, there was a group of the so-called the Antifa or anti-fascist groups, the people who tend to show up in all in black clothing, sometimes with their faces covered. There were about 1,000 of them. And then on another corner, there was a somewhat smaller group, but still hundreds of people organized by a socialist group, the Class Struggle Workers. Now, why don't we have demonstrations like that in Monterey County? Well, I mean, part of it is that obviously Portland is a much bigger city. More people live in Portland itself than live in all of Monterey County. Portland is about 4 times the size of Salinas, Salinas being the biggest city in this county. That's a big difference. Another difference is that Portland is not very diverse. It's about 80% English-speaking white people. The Hispanic or Latino population is less than 10%. And here in Monterey County, about half of the population is Mexican-American. At least 40% of the population speaks Spanish at home. So there is a huge divide essentially between people who speak English and people who speak Spanish. There's not a whole lot of history of those groups working together. So right away, that is going to create differences or difficulties in our ability to mobilize large numbers of people. So those are some key differences. The other was that these organizations, each of these factions, or at least 2 of them, were led by socialist organizations. None of them were led by groups linked to the Democratic Party. My notes are way too much to cover in an hour, so I'm going to spring forward. So immediately after the election of Donald Trump, I began an effort to try to organize people in the community. And within a month of the election, I had met with dozens and dozens of people, various organizations throughout the county. A local Muslim friend of mine and I had put out the idea of creating an emergency coalition to defend human rights in Monterey County. We developed a draft of a 4-point program that we were going to ask local officials, elected officials, to endorse. I, frankly, organized a candlelight vigil at Salinas City Hall in support of sanctuary, in support of Salinas becoming a sanctuary city. First demonstration of its kind in this community after Trump was elected. And we held a meeting actually at the Democratic Party headquarters, but where anyone was invited to come to talk about how all the different groups in this community were going to start working together to form a unified front against the Trump agenda. And we had some success in that. It was a struggle, but there was some success. There was a very large demonstration here on November 20th, right in downtown Monterey, several hundred people, which for this community is a very large turnout. Then I called for a demonstration on January 20th, and that eventually turned in what was called the People's Rally for Unity and Equality. That took place, ended up taking place at the Unitarian Church because the weather was bad and we couldn't do it outdoors. I assembled a steering committee. The steering committee was diverse, in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity. It had two people who were very closely linked with the Democratic Party, and a bunch of people who weren't. Some students, at least two Spanish-speaking people on that steering committee. I wrote a mission statement for the rally that was based on my conversations with dozens and dozens of activists from different constituencies throughout the community that I thought was conveyed the broadest possible, most unified message for the concerns of this community. That mission statement and our rally ended up getting endorsed by at least 30 different organizations in this community. In my experience, no other political or protest event in the past 10 years has had that number of endorsements and the breadth of endorsements that we had. Then I put together the speakers panel, and the panel was diverse and representative of the entire community, and it included students, African American, Mexican American, Native American, gay, lesbian, civil rights activists, anti-fracking activists, reproductive rights activists, and 3 elected of our local elected officials, and a representative from the Muslim community here. Again, this was, in my experience, unprecedented. I've never been to an event in this county that had that level of diversity in terms of who was represented, who was speaking, and so I haven't seen that before here. And that and the consistent message throughout that day and throughout the entire time we were planning the event was one of unity. That instead of having 30 or 40 different groups in this county all working on their own agendas and essentially competing unintentionally, but de facto competing with each other for attention and resources and volunteers, that we were going to figure out a way that we would work together to oppose the Trump agenda. So that day was a great day. The next day was the Women's March, which was probably the largest demonstration I've seen in Monterey County. But then shortly after that, things just started to slide away. Trump came out with his Muslim travel ban. This was which everyone remembers, and there was a great outcry against this, and there was a demonstration organized on fairly short notice, a few days, less than a week's notice, both by a student at Monterey Institute or Middlebury Institute of International Studies, had the idea, contacted me. I helped put this together. We had about 500 people. Again, quite a large demonstration by local standards. Incredibly, much more diverse than anything I've been to in a long time here. It was both because of the large number of young people and students, but also because of the participation of the Muslim community. It was the largest largest number of Muslims I've seen in one place in Monterey County. One longtime activist has been activist here for decades, said that rally was probably, I'm quoting, the most inclusive, congenial, best received, and enjoyable demonstration that I've attended here on the peninsula. that morning, I went to the Democratic Party headquarters, and I was going to pick up signs because while the coalition was working together, we had made many signs, and that was one of the places that the signs were being kept. So the morning of the rally, I went to Democratic Party headquarters to collect some signs for the rally. And I got there, and there were a couple of dozen people there, and they were making signs. And they were making signs for an Indivisible rally that was going to happen later in the week. And I said to the crowd of people, I'll see you all this afternoon at the rally. And about half of the people there didn't even know that the rally was happening. Now, this was just, a couple of weeks at most after we'd spent the past month or two meeting with leaders of the local Democratic Party, talking about unity, how we're all going to work together, and yet this gathering of Democratic Party activists, half of them didn't even know that this rally was happening that afternoon. So that was a sign to me that the coalition building wasn't really taking place. On April 7th, people may remember that Trump ordered the bombing of a Syrian airfield over his chocolate cake, and I quickly did an informal poll of local activists, said we have to demonstrate, we have to do something in response to this. The chair of the local Democratic Party suggested Saturday at noon. So I went with that. I knew that some of the Indivisible groups were meeting that day from noon to 1. There were some other things happening at 2 and 3, so that seemed like a good window of opportunity. So we had that rally, and about 20 people showed up. And the chair of the local Democratic Party wasn't there. A couple of people linked with Indivisible and the Democrats showed up. It was really a disappointing turnout. And then on May 2nd, in late April, a young man from Salinas, a dreamer, was in Monterey County Jail and was detained by ICE. Now, this issue of the detention of and deportation of undocumented immigrants was probably the #1 issue that people in this community were concerned about. There were allegedly more than one rapid response groups that had formed in order to put this, in order to respond to ICE raids, et cetera. So we had a few days' notice, and we put out the word that there was going to be a demonstration on Tuesday afternoon, May 2nd, at Monterey County Jail. And about 24 people showed up. Now, to her credit, there was one person who I know was with the Democratic Party, local Democratic Party Central Committee. There was a sizable group of people from the Brown Berets, a few people from organized labor, SEIU, and then a few other people. I mean, well, fortunately, that event got a lot of media attention, but the fact is that there were about 24 people there protesting what, for months, most of the activists in this community I knew were saying was the #1 issue. So another thing that happened during the first few months after Trump's election was we decided to create a community calendar. The idea being that any activist or anyone could go on the internet, and there would be a centralized calendar where everyone could see these are the events that are happening, these are the meetings that are happening. So if you were planning something, you could decide, I can see something else is happening that day, I don't want to conflict with that. And it was a way for you to get involved in things that were happening. And there were meetings and meetings with countless people to develop this. I pushed very, very hard for this to be created. Eventually, it was, after a great deal of time and effort, it was created. And for a couple of months, it was really working. You would go on there and you would see events almost every day. There was something some progressive group, some left group in the community was doing something. But that's almost completely died out as well. There's, if you go and look at that community involvement, the 831 community involvement calendar, it's very thin, which either means that people aren't doing anything, which I don't believe, or that they've just simply stopped any attempt to communicate with other people about what they're doing. Although I did mention it to someone activist in the community just recently, and she was completely unaware that it existed. So why don't we have the kinds of demonstrations, the kind of actions that we saw in Portland, at least on a smaller level? We wouldn't expect it to be on that size in this community. Why did we go from having the beginnings of what was really looked like a united, diverse, organized, mass protest movement in this community? And how did we go from that from where we are now, which in my opinion is kind of maybe even worse than it was before November, in terms of the fragmentation of the left. And to me, a real turning point was the arrival on the scene of the Indivisible movement. By inauguration day, I believe, or by late January, there were at least 14, there was something like 14 separate indivisible groups meeting in this congressional district. About 10 days after the January 20th People's Rally for Unity and Equality, there was an event, a big Indivisible meeting. It was organized by 3 people, all of whom are very key Democratic Party activists, 2 of whom who had actually been on the steering committee of the People's Rally for Unity and Equality. I didn't go to the meeting, but it was live streamed on Facebook. I was able to watch it from home. And this meeting had a huge turnout. There were something like 200 people there. People couldn't fit in the room. They were out on the street. And I waited for some reference to unity and equality, or some reference to this coalition building that we had spent so much time on, or some acknowledgement that there was an effort being made by various organizations to all come together and work together. I never heard that. The attitude was essentially that it was almost like nothing has been happening and now Indivisible is here to save the day. There was a claim made there that Indivisible was a nonpartisan effort that was meant to put pressure on our elected officials to adhere to a progressive agenda. Well, they can say that, but the fact of the matter is the 3 people who called the meeting are all key members of the Democratic Party in this community. Jimmy Panetta, our new congressperson, phoned into the meeting to congratulate them on starting this Indivisible chapter. He was on speakerphone. And almost everybody in the room, I think, was in some way or other linked to the Democratic Party. So, and that was really the beginning of the end, and in terms of the coalition that had been being built here. And one of the leaders of that meeting actually said at the meeting that he didn't think it was important that all the different groups work together. Now, this is a very heavily Democratic community. It's two to three times as many registered Democrats as Republicans. And that means that the Democratic Party has access to numbers of people in terms of the numbers of people they can turn out and the money and resources that they have access to. They pretty much swamp any other group. Any other organized effort, any organized group in this community can't compete with that. And in effect, they put the kibosh on serious coalition building by getting on this indivisible track. And what is indivisible? Well, the way it's been presented is it's simply a guidebook. There's a guide, indivisible guide, and it's a very limited subset of tactics. They bill it as 4 tactics for 3 people. 3 people being your congressperson and your 2 senators, and there's 4 tactics that are allegedly effective ways to pressure those 3 people. So my question was, if all this guide is a subset, it's a set of tactics, and that is a subset of all the available tactics, why start a group, much less a dozen groups, devoted, that is simply focused on using those 4 tactics? If you really wanted to contribute to building a left movement in this community, you would look at those tactics, say, are these tactics going to work in our situation? For instance, in our situation where our congressmen and our 2 senators are Democrats. And if you think those are good tactics, join an already existing organization and say, we should consider using some of these tactics. These tactics appear to work. That didn't happen. Instead, these tactics were used to start completely new organizations, which in a small community like this means that people aren't going to join those other organizations or are going to leave those organizations because Indivisible is really happening. Indivisible was heavily promoted by Rachel Maddow on her show. She has access to millions and millions of people who watch her show. Robert Reich, another Democrat, has promoted Indivisible. So that's going to, in a community like this, it's just going to suck all the air out of the room. Now, we know that the people who started Indivisible were Democratic Party, they worked for Democratic politicians, that it was heavily promoted on MSNBC, which is essentially the news network of the Democratic Party, and was promoted by Rachel Maddow and people like Robert Reich and Rachel Maddow. We also know, if you've read the book Shattered, which is about the Hillary Clinton campaign, that within 24 hours of her loss to Donald Trump, that she and her staff met and decided that on a story, and the story was, why did we lose? We lost because of Comey and because of the Russians. And now, I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is that people in the DNC saw this enormous outpouring of protest after after Trump was elected. Millions of people who've never protested before, people calling for very, very serious change. And what happened, and that the DNC decided essentially we need to co-opt this. And so, I mean, whether or not you accept that theory has a lot to do with what you actually think about the Democratic Party and who you think the Democratic Party is. But I think the reality is that if you understand that this country is not a democracy, it is a plutocracy or an oligarchy, that you would then understand that although certainly there are differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they're both parties of the 1%. They're both parties of the plutocracy. And to me, that's not even, I mean, that's barely even debatable. It's like saying that the Earth orbits the sun. And just to give you some reason to believe that or understand that, we know that Obama's cabinet was essentially picked by Wall Street. That someone from Citigroup sent Obama before he took office, or actually 1 month before the 2008 presidential election, sent Obama a campaign list of sent his campaign a list of its preferred candidates for cabinet positions. Basically, Citigroup told Obama, this is who we think is acceptable members of your cabinet. And when Obama appointed his cabinet, it was almost exactly identical to that list. Then Obama went about funneling trillions of dollars to the banks and seeing to it that not a single leading Wall Street executive faced any prosecution for collapsing the economy. And in fact, under Obama's presidency, prosecutions of white-collar criminals actually declined from what it had been under Bush. Obama raised more money from Wall Street than any candidate in history. And when he met with leading members he met with the CEOs of the banks, and this was when the average person on the street wanted to string these CEOs up by their necks for destroying the economy. He met with them and said, my administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks. I want to help. I'm not out there to go after you. I'm going to shield you from public and congressional anger. And what happened while Obama was president was that we saw the single greatest increase in inequality in American history. It was the biggest transfer of wealth to the 1% in history. And another interesting fact about the Obama term of office was what happened to the Occupy movement. Now, this is so, if these documents hadn't been made public, I would have written this off as something of a paranoid conspiracy theory. There was a very tightly coordinated campaign that involved the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, local police, and representatives of banks to attack the Occupy movement. And you may recall that people members of the Occupy movement were subject to violent arrests, being hit with tear gas canisters in their heads, put in handcuffs so tight that they were injured. And this was coordinated by something called the Domestic Security Alliance Council. And this was the banks and the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and private security groups working together, sharing information about when the protests were going to happen and who the key protesters were and what could be done to disrupt these protests. And this happened while Obama was president. And let me just say one thing, because I know what a lot of people are going to respond. Some people's response will be, that response will be the usual, Obama did the best he could. He was up against the Republican Congress and the Republican Senate, and his hands were tied. He faced constant obstruction, blah, blah, blah. The FBI, Department of Homeland Security, are members of the executive branch of the government. Congress doesn't have any control over that. These people work and they serve at the president's pleasure. As we know, the president can fire the head of the FBI anytime he wants to. So while the people under his command and control were out there violently attacking the Occupy movement, Obama was adopting the language of the Occupy movement in his speeches, and he would start talking about income inequality and how we have to take steps to eradicate income inequality, all the time while he was because of his policies, income inequality was increasing. Some of you may have heard recently that last year that drug overdoses became the leading cause of death of people under the age of 50. So in the last year of Obama's presidency, the number of people who died from heroin overdoses exceeded all of the Americans killed during the Vietnam War. A similar thing happened when the Soviet Union collapsed and turned to the capitalist road. There was a tremendous increase in economic inequality, and there was a gigantic spike in the mortality rate. And just like in the United States, the leading causes of mortality became in the Soviet Union was mostly alcohol, became abuse, people self-medicating. That's happening in the United States. Since 2010, the alcohol-related deaths have increased amongst whites, blacks, Hispanics, increased across all ethnic groups in this country, and drug abuse, deaths from drug abuse are increasing to record levels because of the terrible economic conditions. The income inequality was worse when Obama left office than when he came in, and the median income fell, wages fell, while corporate profits rose to unprecedented levels. So, no person who is serious about peace, social justice, human rights in general, can think of the Democratic Party as being on their side. It is not on their side. You may think, well, they're the lesser of two evils. I think based on Obama's performance, I'm not even sure you could safely say that. I don't have time, but I could go through dozens of issues that people on the left think are important and point out that Obama's performance was actually worse than George Bush's. But one thing that did happen was that Obama was actually able to convince people, liberals, to support things that they never would have supported if a Republican had endorsed them. And there's a study done about how many people were showing up at anti-war demonstrations, and that the anti-war movement basically tanked after Obama was elected. And the difference was that before he was elected, Democrats went to anti-war demonstrations, and after he was elected and he became in charge of the wars, they stopped going. One of the more disturbing things I ran across was that historically, African Americans have been the most anti-war ethnic group in this country. But back in 2013, when Obama was threatening at that time to attack Syria, something that Trump eventually did, polls actually showed that African Americans were slightly more likely than whites to support bombing Syria. So he essentially was able to take the most anti-war constituency in the country and turn it into a relatively pro-war constituency. I mean, it was still only 40% supported it, but it was more than, it was only 39% of white people supported that. So the last thing, or maybe the last thing, that I want to address is what is the Democratic Party doing, and what is Indivisible, which is essentially a project of the Democratic Party. What are they doing? Well, we'll notice that when Trump bombed Syria, and there was a demonstration here, there was very little presence from the Democratic linked groups or the Indivisible linked groups in this community. Partly because Hillary Clinton went on TV and said essentially that she agreed with Trump what was doing. As awful as Trump is, and he is awful, there's no question, and I think he will go down in history as the worst president in American history, if not the last president in American history. There was one area in which, during his campaign, in which his position was actually preferable than that taken by his opponent, Hillary Clinton. And that was his expressed reluctance to start World War III with the Russians. One of the most disturbing things about Hillary Clinton's campaign for me was her constant, incessant Russia bashing and her eagerness to bomb, to escalate the intervention in Syria, and through the creation of what's called no-fly zones, which most observers believed would bring us into potential direct combat conflict with the Russians, thus potentially setting off a third world war, which would be the last war. And that was really terrifying to me about Hillary Clinton. No matter, I mean, there were many things to fear about Mr. Trump, but Clinton's zeal about starting a third world war with Russia was pretty disturbing. That was one thing that you could say, well, you know, as bad as Trump is, maybe he won't start World War III. Now, if in fact what Trump has, since he's been in office, his policies towards Russia have been actually more hostile to Russia than those of the Obama administration. He did cross the line that Obama was not willing to cross. A lot of people thought that that he would remove the sanctions, economic sanctions, particularly for ExxonMobil. His Secretary of State was the head of ExxonMobil, and the ExxonMobil wants to drill in the Arctic, which would be violate in the Russian Arctic, which is forbidden by the sanctions that Obama put in place. After Trump was elected, ExxonMobil approached the Treasury Department and said, we want a waiver so we can drill in the Russian Arctic, and they were turned down. Steve Mnuchin, Trump's appointment to Treasury Department, turned them down. So if you understand that this is not a democracy, this is a plutocracy or an oligarchy, that the top 1% dominates every significant political, social, cultural, economic institution in this country, and that includes the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, then you should understand that what is happening here with the whole Russiagate brouhaha is there's simply a battle going on between two groups in the oligarchy about who the primary enemy is. And by enemy, I mean who is standing in the way of millionaires and billionaires making more money. Trump and Steve Bannon were members of the group that believes that China is their principal enemy, and they wanted to ease off, reduce tensions with Russia so that they could focus on China. Hillary Clinton and numerous people in the Republican Party saw Russia as the main enemy, and so here we have the most right-wing president of all time, Donald Trump, and the Democratic Party's chief focus in attacking him is the one thing that he was essentially correct on, which is, I don't want to have a World War III with Russia. I mean, of course, he was willing to have World War III with China, so let's not give him too much credit. But that the one decent thing about him is what he is being attacked for by the Democrats. Somehow the Democrats have managed to attack the most right-wing president in history from the right. So from the standpoint of someone who isn't in the 1%, this is a battle between members of the 1%, and it's a battle between the people who want to start World War III with China and the people who want to start World War III with Russia. We don't have a dog in that fight. Rational people who want a peaceful world, an a just world, don't want to start World War III with anyone. The Russiagate investigation to date, there has not been any credible evidence that the Trump administration colluded with Russians to somehow subvert the government or subvert the elections. There has not been a shred of evidence of that produced. And in fact, what has happened is Trump has given in to the pressure and has become much more hostile to Russia than Obama was, thus increasing the likelihood of a nuclear war with Russia, which would kill 100 million people in its first 60 minutes and render the planet uninhabitable for those who managed to survive those first 60 minutes. No progressive person, no person who cares about peace and justice should get behind this campaign. If evidence were actually to come out that any of this were true, that would be something, but to date there has not been any evidence. The sole source of these claims, is the CIA, the NSA, the security state. Why would anyone in their right mind believe these people? I mean, this is probably the one group of people in the ruling elite who's even less credible than Donald Trump. I mean, the CIA and the other members of the intelligence community, they are responsible for millions and millions of deaths, unbelievable suffering throughout the world, and have a long history of subverting elections, sometimes quite openly. And Time magazine in 1996, I believe, had a picture of Boris Yeltsin in Russia holding up an American flag, and the whole article was about how much money the American government had spent to make sure that their friend Boris Yeltsin won the election. I mean, that was an open intervention. Frequently, it's just simply assassinating people who they don't want to get elected. So this whole Russiagate thing so far has been a complete charade. I'm running out of time here, but in the final analysis, the peace and justice movement, the left movement, the progressive movement, whatever you want to call them here in this community, is fractured. It's not working together. There's an enormous divide between English-speaking people and Spanish-speaking people. There was a plan in the works, an actual process in the works back in January, November, December, January, to bring these groups together. There was an agreement from many people in the leadership positions that was what wanted to happen. And then it was just thrown out the window. And it was essentially subverted by Indivisible. Indivisible came along, sucked all the air out of the room, and pretty much put an end to it. There are people in this community who are capable, who have the capacity to provide meaningful, effective leadership to a progressive movement in Monterey County. There are young people, there are students, there are people of color. If you look at the quote-unquote leadership around here, it's white people, English-speaking people, people older than I am. There are people who have the capacity to lead. They are not stepping up to the plate. I understand why they aren't stepping up to the plate. They have jobs, they have lives, they have children, they have 2 jobs, they have schooling, they have degrees they're trying to achieve, and they're impeded by an old guard of white English-speaking retirees who are set in their ways and don't want anyone rocking the boat. But those people are going to need to step up to the plate. I'm not going to do it. I'll help someone who wants to do it, but I can't do it. I'm not the guy. It shouldn't be someone like me. It should be young people. It should be people of color, the students who need to step up. That's what will make a difference. And if you want to step up, you'll have my full support. Thanks.